Welcome to one of the most unsettling stories ever documented in rural Pennsylvania. Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is as you listen. It's always fascinating to see when and where these strange tales reach people. In the fall of 1920, 3 men arrived in the quiet township of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Their job seemed simple: clean and restore an abandoned Victorian house that had been left untouched for nearly 70 years. But what started as routine work soon took a dark and mysterious turn. The house, known to locals as the Blackwood Estate, stood near the edge of the Allegheny Forest, its decaying exterior a silent witness to decades of neglect. County records showed it had been empty since 1850, after the unexplained disappearance of its original owners. Over the years, the deed changed hands several times, but no one ever moved in until a distant heir from Boston decided to renovate and sell it. Architecturally, the house wasn't unique, a 3-story Victorian with gabled roofs and ornate trim typical of wealthy homes built in the mid-1800s. What made it truly remarkable was its eerie isolation. Surrounded by nearly 40 acres of forest and standing half a mile from the nearest home, the estate seemed deliberately separated from the world, despite being only 3 miles from town. Historical records, many of which were later lost in a courthouse fire, showed that the property was first purchased in 1842 by Dr. Elias Blackwood, a physician from Boston. He spent a fortune building the home, completed in 1845, and was described in local newspapers as a man of science, wealth, and education. Though he ran a small medical practice, much of his time was devoted to private research, the nature of which was never clearly defined. By 1920, the Blackwood Estate had become infamous in Millbrook. There were no dramatic ghost stories or warnings about it, just an unspoken understanding that it was a place best avoided, especially after dark. Even animals seemed to sense something was wrong. Locals said not even birds perched on its roof. The renovation team was led by Robert Davenport, a respected 42-year-old contractor from Philadelphia. His crew included Michael Harrington, a war veteran and skilled foreman, and Thomas Weiss, a young craftsman known for his precision work. They checked into a local boarding house on September 14, 1920, expecting to stay for about 3 weeks. Davenport told the innkeeper it was just routine work, some cleaning repairs, and nothing unusual. His company had restored dozens of historic buildings across Pennsylvania and earned praise for its meticulous preservation methods. For the first few days, everything seemed ordinary. The men cleared brush, repaired windows, and began fixing water damage. Townsfolk saw them walking back from the estate each evening, tired but cheerful. But on September 18th, things began to shift. Store receipts showed new purchases: 50 pounds of lime, large amounts of kerosene, sealed glass jars, and medical-grade alcohol. When asked, Davenport claimed they were dealing with mold, but witnesses later recalled that his explanation didn't quite fit. Their boarding house host, Mrs. Simmons, noted that the men kept a strict schedule, eating breakfast at 6, working all day, and returning at dusk. They were polite, sociable, even talking about politics, architecture, and their progress on the house. But not once did they mention anything strange about the property. On Sunday, September 19th, they attended church like everyone else, sitting quietly through the service, blending into the congregation. No one could have guessed it would be the last time anyone in Millbrook saw them alive. That Sunday afternoon, Davenport stopped by the small Millbrook library, asking about the Blackwood family and the town's early history. The librarian, Miss Margaret Wilson, couldn't help much. Most of the records had long been sent to the county archives in Harrisburg, but she directed him to Harold Jenkins, an elderly local known as the town's unofficial historian. When Sheriff Hayes later interviewed Jenkins about the events at the estate, the old man recalled that Davenport had visited him that same afternoon, asking unusually specific questions about Dr. Elias Blackwood. his research, his standing in the community, and the reason for his sudden disappearance in 1850. Jenkins told Davenport what little he knew, that Blackwood had been a respected but withdrawn man, rumored to conduct strange experiments, and that one night he had simply left without a word. Jenkins also mentioned an old legend, how in the months before Blackwood vanished, people had reported strange noises from the direction of the estate. A mixture of grinding metal and an eerie humming that seemed both mechanical and alive. Most unsettling of all, Jenkins shared an old rumor that Blackwood had built some kind of underground structure beneath his house. Davenport seemed especially interested in that part. He pressed Jenkins for details about what the structure might have been, for how deep it went, and whether anyone had ever investigated it. Jenkins couldn't tell him much. No one had ever proved the rumors true. But he did recall hearing that in the 1880s, a group of boys who broke into the house on a dare claimed they found a bricked-up doorway in the cellar with strange symbols on the bricks. Jenkins later told the sheriff that Davenport's interest in these old stories had struck him as excessive, almost obsessive for someone supposedly hired just to clean and restore the place. When asked why he hadn't said anything at the time, Jenkins replied that at his age he'd learned to mind his own business. But he added something that stayed with the sheriff. When I mentioned those markings on the bricks, there was something in his eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. What happened in the days that followed became the subject of one of the most perplexing investigations in county history. According to Mrs. Simmons's written account, around the 10th day of their stay, the men's behavior began to change. They stopped eating in the dining room and started taking their meals in their rooms. Harrington developed a harsh cough that kept others awake, and Weiss, usually quiet but polite, stopped speaking entirely. Mrs. Simmons noted that this shift began after Thursday, September 23rd, when they returned to the boarding house much later than usual, after 8 o'clock, and not together. Harrington arrived first filthy, not with the usual construction dust, but with dark soil as if he'd been digging. Half an hour later, Davenport and Weiss came back whispering until they noticed Mrs. Simmons and abruptly fell silent. Another boarder, James Crawford, recalled sitting on the porch that evening. He saw Harrington walking up the path, pale and drenched in sweat despite the cool weather. When Crawford greeted him, Harrington didn't answer. Later, when Davenport and Weiss arrived, Crawford overheard Davenport giving orders in a low voice. "Keep it contained. We'll need special equipment." When they noticed him, Davenport nodded politely, but Weiss's face, Crawford said, was pure terror. The next morning, Friday the 24th, things grew even stranger. Instead of leaving together, the men went out at different times. Davenport left first just after sunrise, Weiss an hour later, and Harrington not until midday. Mrs. Simmons said he spent the morning pacing in his room, looking pale and feverish. When she offered to call a doctor, he laughed and said, "No doctor can help with this, ma'am." That afternoon, Davenport made two odd requests. First, he asked if there was a telegraph office in town, and when told there wasn't, he paid a local boy to deliver a message to Harrisburg. The contents were never discovered. Then, he borrowed Mrs. Simmons's Bible, insisting it be a full edition, with the Apocrypha included. On Saturday, September 25th, the men left early as usual, but returned separately. Davenport came back mid-afternoon, strangely clean, for a man doing renovation work. Harrington arrived near sunset, dazed and confused repeatedly, asking Mrs. Simmons what day it was. Weiss didn't return until after midnight. The night clerk, Jonathan Pierce, said he barely recognized him. Weiss looked deathly pale, and his work boots were gone. Pierce remembered how Weiss moved stiff mechanical. Like each motion took effort, and when he asked if he was all right, Weiss stared for nearly a minute before saying in a flat, hollow voice, "I am here. I am still here." That night, Weiss climbed the stairs, leaving muddy footprints across the hall carpet. Pierce remembered noticing he wasn't wearing his boots, just his socks. The next morning, only Davenport came down for breakfast. When Mrs. Simmons asked about the others, he said they were feeling unwell and planned to rest. He left alone for the Blackwood estate soon after. Around noon, worried about Harrington's worsening cough, Mrs. Simmons tried to check on him, but there was no answer. Weiss's door was silent too. Strangely, several townspeople later claimed to have seen Davenport wandering through Millbrook that morning instead of working at the estate. Albert Mason, the town pharmacist, reported that Davenport came into his shop around 9 o'clock, asking for the strongest sedatives he could provide and a bottle of iodine. When Mason explained that such medicines required a prescription, Davenport grew insistent, claiming the matter was one of public safety. Mason refused, suggesting he see Dr. Wilson. Then Davenport asked something that unsettled him deeply. Is there any substance that can render a person unconscious and leave no trace afterward? Mason told him to leave immediately. Later, Davenport was seen at Wilson's Mercantile, where he purchased a bottle of chloroform, saying it was for cleaning delicate woodwork. Such sales weren't restricted at the time, but the shopkeeper Theodore Wilson thought the request strange enough to mention to others an offhand comment that later became key evidence. Davenport returned to the boarding house early that afternoon, around 1 o'clock, and abruptly asked for transport to the Harrisburg train station 20 miles away. He took only a small leather satchel, leaving behind his other belongings. When Mrs. Simmons asked about Harrington and Weiss, he said simply that they'll sort themselves out and handed her a month's extra rent before leaving. That was the last time anyone saw Robert Davenport. Howard Miller, the town's only car operator, drove him to Harrisburg. Miller told investigators that Davenport seemed agitated, constantly glancing behind them, as though expecting to be followed. About halfway there, Davenport asked him to stop near the edge of the Allegheny forest. He got out, walked to the tree line, and stood staring into the woods for several minutes. When he returned, he was shaking and asked how far the forest stretched, if it contained any caves or strange formations. As they neared Harrisburg, he changed his destination, asking to be dropped at the Western Union office instead of the train station. Miller waited outside while Davenport sent a telegram, then took him to the Harrisburg Grand Hotel. Records confirmed Davenport checked in at 4 p.m., but checked out unexpectedly just before midnight, leaving his bill paid and all his luggage behind. Back in Millbrook, Mrs. Simmons grew alarmed when neither Harrington nor Weiss appeared that evening. She contacted Sheriff William Hayes. Upon forcing open their doors, deputies found both rooms empty. Personal belongings still in place, including wallets and identification, but the beds undisturbed, as if they hadn't been slept in. In Harrington's room, they found a handkerchief stained not with blood or sputum, but dark soil. A notebook on his desk contained technical sketches of underground chambers labeled Primary Containment Area and Secondary Barrier System. On the last page, in shaky handwriting, were the words, Structural integrity compromised. Estimated 3 to 5 days before complete failure. Artie refuses to acknowledge the implications. In Weiss's room, his clothes were laid out neatly on the bed. Even his socks, suggesting he'd changed entirely before leaving. Inside the wardrobe were his boots, their soles caked with a sticky black residue. Chemical tests by Dr. Wilson revealed organic material consistent with decay and traces of an unknown metallic compound. More disturbing were markings carved into the floorboards beneath the window symbols, nearly identical to those later found in the Blackwood estate's cellar. With 2 men missing and Davenport vanished, Sheriff Hayes assembled a search team at dawn on September 27th. The group included Deputy Frank Morgan, Dr. Wilson, and 3 local hunters familiar with the area. As they approached the estate, they noticed an unnatural stillness. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just a hollow, absolute silence extending 200 yards around the house. Inside the home looked half-finished tools, scattered work abruptly abandoned. In the main parlor, a section of floor had been removed, exposing an entrance to what appeared to be a hidden passage. Morgan's report described it as not a conventional cellar door, but a slanted tunnel sealed long ago and recently reopened. Dr. Wilson's statement added that the opening was 3 feet wide and lined with unusually dense dark bricks, unlike any he'd seen used in the region. The mortar between the bricks had been carefully removed, each one stacked neatly beside the tunnel's mouth. It wasn't the chaotic work of someone digging in a panic. This had been done with patience, precision, and purpose. What drew the most attention were the markings on the bricks themselves. Symbols impressed into the surface during manufacture, not carved later. They bore no resemblance to any alphabet or number system anyone present could identify. Initially, Sheriff Hayes instructed Deputy Morgan to stay upstairs while he and Dr. Wilson examined the tunnel. But in the end, all 3 men descended, leaving the rest of the search party to inspect the house above. Lanterns flickered as they moved into the passage, revealing not a simple cellar, but a steep, man-made tunnel, slanting deep beneath the house's foundation. The air grew heavy and stale. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the structure extended far beyond the footprint of the estate. Hayes's official report described 3 distinct chambers connected by narrow corridors. The walls were smooth masonry instead of rough stone, each block marked by strange symbols scattered unevenly along its surface. Years later, Professor Walter Hammond from Miskatonic University examined the site and remarked that the markings faintly resembled ancient European runes, though he admitted their meaning was lost to any known linguistic system. The first chamber sat nearly 20 feet below ground. Inside, the searchers found what looked like living quarters, a cot, a small table, a kerosene lamp, and shelves cluttered with scientific instruments, microscopes, specimen jars, and glass slides. On the table lay a journal written in Michael Harrington's hand. The last dated entry, September 24th, read, "Day 9 of excavation. We have cleared the passage to the second chamber and partially removed the wall to the third. D believes we are near the primary containment area. Air quality worsens with every hour. W shows signs of auditory hallucination and detachment. D blames the air, but I am not convinced." The passage to the second chamber showed clear signs of recent digging. Loose soil lined the floor, still damp and freshly turned. As they advanced, the temperature dropped sharply down to 42 degrees, according to Dr. Wilson's thermometer, unnaturally cold for both the season and the depth. The second chamber bore evidence of recent work tools neatly arranged in a circular pattern around a section of excavated floor. At its center was a hole about 3 feet deep, and at the bottom, a round stone slab 6 feet across and 8 inches thick. The slab was carved with intricate symbols, similar to those on the walls, but far more elaborate. Embedded along its edge were 8 metal rings, each marked with identical engravings. Dr. Wilson noted the slab was not native to Pennsylvania. It was black basalt, impossibly dense and smooth, the kind of rock found only in volcanic regions. Tool marks showed repeated attempts to lift it. The soil around the slab was damp, dark, and oily, releasing an odor of rot and iron. Dr. Wilson took samples for study, but his report was never made public. Deputy Morgan later told the Millbrook Gazette that under the microscope, the soil revealed structures that were neither mineral, plant, nor animal, but something disturbingly in between. Beyond this, a low tunnel led to the third and final chamber. Unlike the others, this one had been intentionally sealed. The passage blocked by massive fitted stones bound with a black resin-like material. Dr. Wilson described it as tarry yet inorganic, and chemical tests later suggested it contained unknown elements, substances not recognized by contemporary science. Inside that chamber, The air was colder still, and the walls were covered in charcoal drawings. Anatomical sketches of something unearthly, a shape with no spine, no bones, and dozens of branching limbs radiating from a pulsing center. More of the same symbols appeared beneath the drawings, arranged in rows like mathematical notation. On a crude wooden table lay three things: a leather-bound journal dated 1847 to 1850, a set of antique surgical tools, and three glass jars containing preserved organic matter, tissue, or organs of uncertain origin. The official report described them delicately as biological specimens, but Deputy Morgan later told the Gazette they looked too human to dismiss, yet not human enough to explain. In the corner of that chamber sat Thomas Weiss, alive but motionless. His eyes were open, his face blank, and he did not respond when spoken to or touched. Dr. Wilson examined him on site and later wrote, "No physical injury, no reaction to light, sound, or pain. Catatonia profound and unbroken." Weiss was taken to Harrisburg State Hospital, where he remained for 33 years, never speaking again. Dr. Wilson's hospital notes describe his condition in chilling detail. Pulse slow, body temperature constant at 95 degrees. Reflexes intact but dulled. At intervals of 37 minutes, the patient's right hand rises and traces a series of shapes in the air, symbols identical to those found on the walls beneath the Blackwood estate. Michael Harrington was never found. The only trace of him was a single mud-caked boot, discovered at the edge of the forest, half buried in the soil, where the manicured grounds met the tree line. Searchers combed the woods for days after finding Harrington's boot, but nothing else turned up, not a trace of him. He was officially declared missing, and despite periodic searches over the next 2 years, no further evidence ever surfaced. Dr. Wilson's examination of the boot only deepened the mystery. The leather had decayed in a strange pattern that spread upward from the sole, its texture brittle and gray. Around the laces and eyelets, he found traces of the same black, oily substance recovered from Weiss's boots. Stranger still, the metal nails that held the sole together had somehow transformed into another material, similar to silver, but not quite. Metallurgical testing failed to identify it conclusively. In the days after the Blackwood discovery, Sheriff Hayes interviewed townspeople who had interacted with the three men. A clearer picture began to form. Davenport hadn't come to Millbrook simply to restore an old house. Timothy Rogers, the boy who carried Davenport's telegram to Harrisburg, recalled that Davenport had questioned him intensely about local legends surrounding the estate. He wanted to know if anyone ever went missing near there, the boy told investigators. Then he asked if I'd ever heard strange noises, said something about a humming sound. When I told him my grandfather had mentioned one once, he gave me an extra $1 and told me to think hard about any other details. The most revealing evidence came from the journal found in the underground chamber, the personal writings of Dr. Elias Blackwood himself. The sheriff's office never released the full contents. But fragments later appeared in a 1936 academic monograph by Professor Walter Hammond of Miskatonic University, titled Architectural Anomalies in Early Pennsylvania Estates. According to Hammond, the journal revealed that Blackwood saw himself not merely as a physician, but as a natural philosopher studying the threshold between life and non-life. His early experiments focused on preserving organic tissue, but gradually shifted towards stranger metaphysical goals. One passage dated April 1849 read, "Success at last." The barrier has been breached, though, in a limited fashion. That which exists beyond responds to frequencies of sound and light. Communication remains imperfect. They perceive time as a single unbroken current. Their interest in living tissue is observational, perhaps even curious, though such words are inadequate. A later entry from June 1849 warned of growing instability. The containment measures remain effective, but I observe material degradation. The entities exert an influence upon matter akin to erosion, but operating by principles unknown. Metal near the containment weakens shifts in structure. Organic matter breaks down and reforms in unnatural patterns. If properly directed, the process could revolutionize medical science. The final dated entry, April 1850, was short and grim. It is too late. What we have invited cannot be uninvited. I have sealed the chambers as best I can. It is postponement, not resolution. Whoever finds this understands some doors once opened can never truly be closed. After the discovery, Sheriff Hayes ordered the subterranean chambers filled with concrete. The Blackwood estate was abandoned, its restoration permanently halted. In 1925, during a violent thunderstorm, fire consumed what remained of the structure. Witnesses described the blaze as unnatural, its flames burning white and tinged with blue, moving against the wind. There was no smoke, no sound, only light. Fire Chief Edward Simmons later wrote that the fire concentrated directly above the sealed cellar, burning hot enough to melt portions of the foundation stone at temperature beyond anything seen in a typical house fire. Water seemed to have no effect. The flames hissed and twisted, but would not die until the entire house had been reduced to glassy ash. Afterward, the township purchased the land, declaring it unfit for development. Yet the property's reputation only grew darker. Hunters began to report strange bouts of disorientation near the site. Compasses spun aimlessly, and even experienced woodsmen lost their bearings in clear daylight. In 1928, a University of Pennsylvania geology team recorded unexplained magnetic interference within half a mile of the ruins. Then, in 1927, a man calling himself Richard Daniels was admitted to a sanatorium in western Massachusetts. His description matched Robert Davenport. Doctors noted that he suffered from obsessive delusions about underground spaces and entities beneath the crust of the earth. He died 2 years later, raving about doors that breathe and voices that do not use sound. The death certificate listed pneumonia as the cause, but those who saw him in his final days swore his skin had taken on the same faint gray sheen as the stone beneath the Blackwood estate. The medical records that surfaced years later at Miskatonic University's Department of Abnormal Psychology revealed fragments of the final haunting link in the Blackwood mystery. Within them were transcripts of interviews conducted during Robert Davenport's, by then Richard Daniels', fleeting lucid moments in 1928. His recollections of Millbrook were disjointed, but deeply unsettling. "We found the chambers just as Blackwood described," he told his interviewer. "The old fool thought symbols and stone could hold them, but they don't see barriers the way we do. To them, solid matter is only dense probability, and probability can be changed." When asked about his missing colleagues, Daniels grew agitated. "Harrington was taken first," he said. "He touched the surface without protection. It started at his fingers like his flesh wasn't sure if it existed. By morning it had reached his mind. Weiss lasted longer, but he looked too deep into the space beneath the stone. His body stayed here, but the rest of him, they took that elsewhere." Most disturbing was his account of what lay beneath the stone slab. "Not a creature," he said slowly. "An absence that thinks. A consciousness without form." Blackwood thought he was studying it, but it was studying him. Studying us. Waiting. When pressed to elaborate, Daniels only smiled and whispered, "They're patient. They measure time in epochs, not years. What's a century to something that existed before the earth cooled?" In 1932, Professor Walter Hammond of Miskatonic University conducted the only formal academic investigation of the Blackwood affair. He spent 3 weeks in Millbrook, poring over surviving records and interviewing witnesses. But he cut his research short citing what he called a persistent nervous condition. His monograph, published 4 years later, treated the estate as a minor architectural curiosity, avoiding any mention of the strange discoveries or deaths. Yet his private letters told another story. In correspondence with colleagues, Hammond confessed to hearing a low humming sound while surveying the ruins, barely audible, but constant, accompanied by a sensation of being observed by something without eyes. In one letter to Dr. Henry Armitage Miskatonic's head librarian, Hammond wrote, "I am convinced that what Blackwood discovered and what Davenport later uncovered was not biological, but ontological. It challenges the nature of reality itself. The divisions we draw between matter and energy, between life and death, are conveniences of perception, not truth." By 1952, the last official mention of the case appeared in Millbrook Township's records when Sheriff Hayes's files were moved into deep storage. A clerk noted that the files were incomplete, several photographs, and the original Blackwood Journal had vanished. 3 years later, a retired Deputy Morgan gave a final interview offering perhaps the most chilling reflection of all. "We never did learn what they found under that slab," he said. "But I believe it followed them out." He went on to describe how after the tunnels were sealed, strange phenomena plagued Millbrook. People reported faint mechanical sounds at night, as if machinery were operating underground. Dogs refused to go near certain streets. Lights flickered for no reason. Telephones rang with no one there. Even the concrete sealing the chamber wouldn't hold new cracks. Appeared every few weeks, always forming the same patterns as the symbols on the walls below. It was like something was testing the barrier, Morgan said, patiently, systematically. He revealed that Sheriff Hayes had quietly maintained watch over the property for years. "Bill was never the same after what we found," Morgan recalled. He went back to that site every month until he died in '39. Said he needed to make sure it stayed quiet. He told me once after too much whiskey that he believed the chambers were a door that swings both ways. When I asked what that meant, he said only, "Doors can be approached from either side." Decades later, in 1963, while clearing land for the new interstate highway, construction workers uncovered a network of tunnels near the old Blackwood site structures, absent from every geological or utility map. The foreman deemed them unsafe, and they were filled with concrete. But not before one worker, Charles Miller, described what he'd seen. "Those tunnels weren't like anything I've ever seen," he told a local paper years later. "The walls were made of some dark stone, polished smooth, colder than ice. It was July, but down there you could see your breath. The air tasted metallic, like blood on a coin." Miller recalled strange metal discs embedded in the walls, each etched with intricate markings that shimmered when light hit them. "They vibrated, or maybe the light made it seem that way," he said. "None of us wanted to touch them." At the end of the tunnel lay a circular chamber with a raised platform covered in what looked like scientific equipment. Tubes, coils, metal frames, all coated in fine black dust that seemed to move on its own. It shifted, Miller said, like it was alive, forming patterns, when the light hit it, then settling again. The foreman took one look and ordered us out. The next day, government men showed up and we were reassigned. By the late 1960s, Millbrook had all but faded from the map. The post-war boom passed it by, its population dwindling as the town slowly emptied. When geography professor Caroline Russell visited in 1968 to study local folklore, she found the site absorbed into a state forest preserve and the community's memory of the Blackwood estate almost entirely gone. Residents under 50 had never heard of it, she wrote in her field notes. Those who had remembered refused to speak. She discovered that nearly 30% of Millbrook's population had left the area within a decade of 1920, an anomaly for rural Pennsylvania. They hadn't moved to nearby cities or towns, but scattered across the country as though trying to get as far away as possible. in interviews with surviving former residents. A common thread emerged: a lingering unease, sleepless nights and sounds that could not be traced. One woman, Marion Thompson, who had fled to Oregon in 1928, put it plainly. It wasn't anything you could prove, she said. Just the feeling that something under that ground was still moving. People began to share the same dream of standing in total darkness, something moving just beyond sight, circling closer, but never visible. When 3 members of the same church mentioned having it on the same Sunday, whole families began leaving Millbrook without a word. Yet the strangest part of the story emerged decades later from an unexpected source. In 1967, while cataloging items from Professor Hammond's estate at Miskatonic University, a research assistant found a sealed envelope misfiled among his papers. Inside was a single page, its edges burned and water stained the handwriting, unmistakably that of Dr. Elias Blackwood. The page bore no date, only a chilling passage. They are patient. They think in centuries, not years. They wait in the spaces between moments, in the shadows between thoughts. They are not malevolent, for malevolence is a human notion. They simply are. Once invited, they remain observers, at first, then participants. Below the text was a hand-drawn diagram, concentric circles filled with the same cryptic symbols found carved in the Blackwood chambers. Marginal notes, half illegible, referred to resonance frequencies and thresholds of perception. The bottom line read, "If my calculations are correct, the barrier will require renewal in 75 years. May whoever reads this understand the necessity." Professor Caroline Russell's later research revealed a chilling mathematical pattern at the heart of the Blackwood mystery. 75 years after Dr. Elias Blackwood sealed the chambers beneath his estate in 1850, the cycle reached its next point in 1925, the year the mansion burned in its eerie, soundless fire. If that rhythm held, the following interval would fall in the year 2000. What it signified, no one could say. But Russell noted the pattern with quiet unease, as though suspecting that time itself was part of the design. Thomas Weiss, the only one of the 3 men found alive, existed in silence for the rest of his life. Transferred between hospitals, he eventually ended up at Greylock Sanatorium in western Massachusetts, only a few miles from where Robert Davenport, under the name Richard Daniels, had died years before. Dr. Elizabeth Parker, who treated Weiss from 1947 until his death in 1953, recorded details that defied medical explanation. "The patient shows no muscular atrophy, despite complete paralysis," she wrote in 1950. "His metabolism functions at 1/3 the normal rate. He requires feeding only once, every 72 hours. Most remarkable, he has not aged in 3 decades. But what unsettled staff most were the disturbances that followed Weiss. Objects moved without cause, lights dimmed and flared. Radios emitted low static when brought near his room. Patients in neighboring wards reported identical nightmares, visions of tunnels, cold stone, and a faint humming from below the earth. 3 orderlies resigned after losing hours from their shifts, unable to recall what had happened. Then, on April 17, 1953, at exactly 3:47 a.m., Weiss simply stopped living. No struggle, no decline, just stillness. At that instant, every clock in the facility froze. Witnesses heard a low metallic tone filling the air before vanishing. The autopsy results were sealed, but whispers spread among hospital staff. A nurse claimed Weiss's internal organs were intact, unchanged by time, and that some anatomical features did not match any known human structure. The Blackwood estate itself remains untouched. Modern hiking trails divert far from the site, yet those who stray near report patches of cold air and a feeling of being watched. A 1957 geological survey revealed vast voids beneath the land, too regular to be natural. 5 years later, a U.S. Geological Survey team measured a magnetic field anomaly centered on the property. Compasses swung wildly, and the instruments detected rhythmic fluctuations every 37 minutes, precisely matching the pattern of Weiss's hand movements during his long catatonia. The report blamed ferromagnetic ore deposits, though the team privately admitted that such precise regularity was impossible in any natural formation. Funding for further research vanished without explanation. By 1965, the story of the Blackwood estate had faded into folklore. That year, graduate student Margaret Collins arrived from the University of Pittsburgh to document rural legends. No one she interviewed remembered the Blackwood name. Yet local children whispered about the humming place in the woods, where if you stood still long enough, you could hear a machine running underground. Their parents dismissed it as imagination. Collins recorded another strange belief known as forest time moments, when clocks and watches would slow or race unpredictably. Hikers complained that hours seemed to vanish or that brief walks lasted far longer than they should. Science offered no explanation. Collins wrote in her notes, "Something bends time there. Not breaks, it bends it." Her last recorded observation came in the winter of 1969. An elderly man checked into the same boarding house where Davenport, Harrington, and Weiss had lodged half a century earlier. He asked about the Blackwood property and seemed disappointed to learn it was long gone. For several days he walked the frozen woods near the ruins, always returning near dusk. Before leaving, he gave the proprietor, Martha Wilson, granddaughter of the original innkeeper, an envelope containing a heavy iron key and a single handwritten note. "It still waits below." He signed his name as Hammond. If it was indeed Professor Walter Hammond of Miskatonic University, his presence was impossible. He'd been declared dead 4 years earlier in 1965. The key and note were later turned over to the County Historical Society. But when the society dissolved in 1968, both disappeared. Soon after, residents began reporting faint humming again from the forest at night, the same tone that had haunted Millbrook decades earlier. The following winter, witnesses heard new sounds, grinding metal stone, scraping against stone. And most unsettling of all, voices speaking in unison, wordless but synchronized, echoing through the air for 3 weeks before abruptly ceasing. During that period, a mile-wide ring of clear sky formed directly over the property, while snowstorms raged everywhere else. Meteorologists dismissed it as coincidence, but none could explain how the circle remained perfectly centered. In 1972, a group of spelunkers exploring western Pennsylvania caves found a man-made tunnel intersecting with a natural limestone system, 12 miles from Millbrook. The walls bore tool marks of unknown origin and faint carvings resembling those from the Blackwood chambers. They advanced 50 yards before reaching a collapse, then returned with proper gear, days later only to find the entrance gone. The coordinates were correct, the landmarks unchanged, but the tunnel had vanished. Today, hikers still describe the silence near the site as alive. It isn't absence of sound, they say, but something deeper, a listening quiet that waits. The forest has swallowed all trace of the house, but beneath its roots, the chambers may still lie untouched. The final known incident occurred in 1968, when a geology student from Penn State found a peculiar stone near the site. Inside it appeared to be organic matter, fossilized tissue of no known origin. By morning, the stone had crumbled into fine black powder that moved on its own under a microscope, forming geometric shapes before scattering. The powder etched faint symbols into the metal lab shelf, though it showed no acid or corrosive properties. Officials dismissed it as a prank. Weeks later, the student withdrew from school suffering from severe headaches and night terrors and was never seen again. Perhaps Dr. Elias Blackwood was right when he wrote that some doors once opened can never be closed. What he sealed in 1850 and what Davenport's crew disturbed 70 years later may still persist thinking and waiting in the hidden folds of existence. In Millbrook's Township records, one final note remains appended to the 1937 deed that transferred the estate to public ownership. Let the forest reclaim this place. Let it be forgotten. What sleeps beneath should remain undisturbed. Some secrets belong to the earth. Whether those secrets truly rest is uncertain. For the three men who came in 1920 to restore an old Victorian house, the answer was written in silence and shadow. They uncovered what should have stayed buried and may have become part of it themselves. A final clue surfaced in 1976 when the Harrisburg Public Library received an anonymous book donation. Among them was a weathered leather journal identified as belonging to Robert Davenport. Its early pages were ordinary, filled with sketches and notes about restoration. But by September 17, 1920, his entries darkened. Floor timbers in the parlor are newer than the house. Beneath them, a sealed chamber. H thinks it's a smuggler's cache. I think it's older, much older. By the 20th, his tone bordered on obsession. The symbols on the bricks are familiar somehow. I dream of them at night. His final entry, written the day before he vanished, read, H touched it today. God help him. Something looked through him. It spoke in his voice, asking, How do you perceive time? When W tried to pull him away, H said, You next. I feel it behind my own eyes now. The barrier is failing. The rest of the page was blank. The journal disappeared from the library's collection in 1985, leaving behind only blurred photographs of several pages, images so distorted they seemed to shift when viewed too long. Some say the story of Millbrook is unfinished, trapped between history and myth. Others say that's the point, that what happened beneath the Blackwood estate never ended. The doors were opened, and something on the other side has been listening ever since.